So, as it was mentioned, the title of my talk, which is very relevant to my PhD research, is the notion of the uncanny and intersubjective disruptions in experiences of depression. What I researched, part of my research in the PhD thesis was interpersonal or intersubjective disruptions that take place in depression. And I looked to bring various notions, various concepts which were either underexplored before or were not merged together in our examination of subjective experiences of depression, such as the uncanny, the unhomelike, notions of mood, attunement, possibilities. In this talk, I will be focusing on this one aspect that I looked into, the notion of the uncanny and how it affects, in most cases, negatively affect a person's interpersonal relationships. Now, let me start with the three kind of statements or observations that are gonna guide this talk. First, through looking at first-person accounts of depression, one of the most common aspects that one can find is that the experience of depression is such a fundamentally distinct way of being in the world that it is very, very often experienced as unhomelike. So this is where the notion of the uncanny comes in, as we will see in a little bit, where what used to be homelike, what used to be habitually experienced as homelike, is now experienced as unhomelike in experience, giving rise to something uncanny in experience. Now, being the case, that the experience of depression is unhomelike, is foreign, is alienating, is something so fundamentally distinct to what other people experience or what the depressed person previously experienced. Depressed individuals report that the experience of depression is indescribable to and incomprehensible by non-depressed individuals. We will explore both of these aspects today. People expressing the fact that they cannot meaningfully or effectively describe depression, and also that that experience is incomprehensible by other people. So these are two additional aspects that came as an outcome or as a finding in my thesis. This continuous and very profound aspect of experience of depression, that they refer to an experience that is effectively indescribable and incomprehensible by other people. As a result of these, of the above two observations, the fact that depression is experienced as unhomelike and that it cannot be effectively described or comprehended by other people, depressed people often use metaphorical language to describe their experience, such as incarcerated, imprisoned, suffocating, living in a bubble, living in a world in between, and also some other ones, alienating, isolating, detached. Now, the question that arises at this point, and which I investigate, is what exactly do people mean when they say, I live in a bubble, I am suffocating, I feel imprisoned in depression? And of course, given that we cannot take this language literally, the question is raised: what exactly do people mean when they describe their experience in these terms? So I will begin with an analysis of the uncanny through the notions of the homelike and the unhomelike. Next, I will focus on the issues of indescribability and incomprehensibility in depression, and I will demonstrate the metaphorical language that people use to describe their experience. and suggest some ways in which we can analyze that experience. So all these three observations will be done within the light of some intersubjective disruptions. Now, to gain a broader perspective on the concepts of homelikeness and unhomelikeness and their relevance in comprehending experience of depression, I will draw upon the concepts of the Unheimlich and the Heimlich as they were formulated by Ernst Jentsch and Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century. So we start with Ernst Jentsch. So Jentsch says that the uncanny, or let's start with the familiar, as he says here. What is familiar in experience appears not only as welcome, but also as straightforwardly self-evident. And he gives the example of the sunrise. When we experience a sunrise, we experience it as a fact, as straightforwardly self-evident. It is not questioned, it is not doubted, it is expected, right? So it is experienced as something familiar. Now, when it comes to experiencing something as uncanny, this means to describe something that is an experience in which one does not feel at home or at ease, or a case in which the situation is foreign to him. And within this context, both Jentsch and Freud say that the uncanny arises when both the unhomelike and the homelike arise in experience. And Jentsch gives the example of a wax figure. So how he explains it is that a wax figure is something homelike because a human wax figure, because they have human characteristic. From a distance, we might be mistaken to take them for a real human being. Maybe their face is very expressive, but at the same time, they also have an unfamiliar aspect, precisely because they are not alive. They're just a wax figure. So a very human-like wax figure, Jentsch says, is uncanny because it possesses both familiar and unfamiliar characteristics. And this is where the uncanny arises. So in the merging of both the homelike and the unhomelike. The same is suggested by Freud, in which he says that the German word unheimlich is obviously the opposite of heimlich, heimisch meaning familiar, native, belonging to the home. And we're tempted to conclude that what is uncanny is frightening precisely because it is not known and familiar. And he also notes that Heimlich belongs to two sets of ideas which, without being contradictory, are yet very different. On the one hand, it means that which is familiar and congenial, and on the other, that which is concealed and kept out of sight. Whereas unheimlich expresses something uneasy, eerie, and blood-curdling. Now, we see the notions here being mixed and both arising. So the notion of the homelike, the heimlich, is at the same time what is familiar, but also what is kept out of sight, which is also what the unfamiliar is. So within this context, what is, let's say, belonging to the home, what is homelike, is also concealed from the outside world. So by taking both together, the uncanny arises. And this is relevant, as we will see later, in experience of depression, where what was previously experienced as homelike, what was previously experienced as familiar, is now after the onset of depression experienced as unhome-like. And therefore, thereby there is an uncanniness, an uncanny feeling in the experience of depression. So let's look a bit more before moving into some depression testimonies, how the home-like and the unhome-like merge in experience and how they provide us with the uncanny aspect. So at the same time, Freud's at what is home-like, precisely understood as something which exists in the four walls of one's house, also expresses what is concealed, kept from sight, and withheld from others. Therefore, Freud adds Heimlich also expresses something which is mystical, obscure, and inaccessible. In other words, something unhome-like. Therefore, Freud further adds, what is Heimlich thus comes to be unheimlich, further emphasizing that Heimlich is a word the meaning of which develops towards an ambivalence until it finally coincides with its opposite, unheimlich. In these terms, as Freud suggests, the uncanny is in reality nothing new or foreign, but something familiar and old. So before we move on, the important thing to understand here, I think, is that when we speak of the home-like and the unhome-like, we don't speak of two polar opposites, which each of which is the total opposite of the other, but concepts which include characteristics of each other. So when they give rise to the concept of the feeling of the uncanny, it is revealed that these two concepts, the home-like and the unhome-like, are really, as Freud puts it here, nothing new or foreign, but something familiar and old. And I want to stand on particularly on the last sentence, because this is what emerges in experiences of depression too, as we will see in a bit, where depressed individuals, report that the world which used to be experienced as familiar, as home-like, as a world in which the depressed person could participate and actualize different possibilities, is now a world which is foreign, alienating, and inaccessible. So we don't speak of two different worlds, but we speak about the same world, but experienced in a fundamentally different way. Now, as we have seen the concepts of the home-like and the unhome-like and the uncanny as well as they arise within Jentsch's and Freud's work, let's now start seeing accounts of depression which express the unhome-like aspect of depression and see how we can apply the concept of the uncanny in these testimonies. So, as Sally Brampton, start with Sally Brampton in her book Shoot the Dumb Dog, a memoir of depression, she says, depression is a terrible sense of our own overwhelming reality, a reality that we know has nothing to do with the reality that we once knew, and from which we think we will never escape. So it's interesting to begin with to see and to highlight the contrast that Brampton is making here between the reality that we once knew and the reality that we experience now. So she highlights this contrast as a world which used to be experienced differently than is experienced now. A world which used to be familiar but no longer is. And another important thing that we will look in more detail further on is this inescapability that people feel in depression and from which we think we will never escape. That is, feeling that it will never one cannot go back um, to how they experienced the world before depression. Now, I'm not here to say uh, to make a judgment as to whether this is true, whether people can or cannot go back to how they experience the world as home-like, but I'm here to demonstrate that at least this is a part of the experience. It is a very um, persistent and profound aspect of the experience that people feel that they can never escape depression. Furthermore, Smith puts it in the following words: depression remakes the world. It begins, and the familiar world is seen as if through isinglass, recognizable in its outlines, but dimly. It loses substance. Sight and sound and set alike are gone, unaccountably blunt. You are resident now in some parallel universe. So again, through Smith's account, we see that it's the same world that is different. It is the familiar, the otherwise familiar, or the previously familiar world that is now experienced as different. And when it loses substance, people express this almost otherworldly aspect of depression experiences. But it's almost always has to do with some comparison between how the world used to be experienced in the past or how other people experience the world. So it's interesting to notice this contrast that depressed people make between how they used to experience the world in the past and their current experience of the world, or the current experience of other people and the depressed person experience of other people of the world. So I would like to focus on this aspect of inescapability of depression, because I think it's very striking. So what seems to exacerbate feelings of unhomelikeness in depression is the feeling that as individuals realize that what used to be homelike is now experienced as unhomelike, they find it challenging to envision a return to how they ordinarily experience the world as homelike. So as Brampton puts it, again, depression feels like the most isolated place on earth. I thought I had no hope of ever making it back to that place I called life. In a series of interviews that David Karp made, one person he interviewed said, I felt sort of overwhelmed by the situation, and I was kind of sad that I was living the way I was living, and I didn't quite know how to get myself out of it. I guess a sense of feeling trapped. I think it was a recognition that this was not the way I wanted to live, but also the fact that I did not know how to get myself out of it. And finally, let's look at this quote and look at them together. I was terribly alone, lost in a harsh and faraway place, a horrible terrain reserved for me alone. There was nowhere to go, nothing to see, no panorama. Though this landscape surrounded me, vast and amorphous, I couldn't escape the awful confines of my leaden body and downcast eye. So the importance of these accounts is that not only the world is experienced as unhomelike, but what seems to exacerbate the feeling of unhomelikeness is that there seems to be no return to how the world or how the experience of the world was before the onset of depression. And perhaps we can, although I've not done this in this presentation, connect that to the elements of hope that are commonly absent from experience of depression, that there is no hope that things will get better in the future, which of course coincides with temporal disruptions in depression as well. The fact that I cannot envision how the world could be better in the future puts the depressed person in a state of feeling trapped and feeling that nothing can change. Now, summing up the previous observation or statement, there is the very common feeling that depression is an unhome-like being in the world. And my suggestion is that this comes or arises because of the presence of both the home-like and the unhome-like in experience. So the uncanniness arises both because people are kind of, we could say, nostalgic about how their life used to be before the onset of depression, but they also compare their life, their experience of the world with how other people currently experience the world. Other people, they say, have access to the world's possibilities. They're able to actualize those possibilities. They're able to participate in the world. They're able to establish a sense of belonging in the world. But the depressed person feels that they cannot. Now, moving on from the aspect of the unhome-like, there are suggestions, or the suggestion that I am making and the connection that I am making here is that the experience of depression is to such an extent unhome-like or uncanny that people feel that they cannot effectively describe their experience of depression in ordinary language. So let's look at a few quotations which express this indescribability of depression and look how we can examine them. As Styron says, depression is a disorder of mood, so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self as to verge close to being beyond description. The horror of depression is so overwhelming as to be quite beyond expression. Wolpert echoes this. Severe depression borders on being beyond description. It is not just feeling much lower than usual. It is a quite different state, a state that bears only a tangential resemblance to normal emotion. What is interesting here in Wolpert's statement, and something we will look at in a slide afterwards, is the statement by Wolpert that depression is not just feeling much lower than usual. It's not just feeling under the weather or being sad or being a bit melancholic. It's a different state, Wolpert says. So within this, Wolpert gives some of the stigma that characterizes depression. It's like they try to demonstrate that depression is something else, another state, a different state to normal emotion, and not just something that can resemble normal emotion. And Manning also echoes Wolpert and Styron. She says, I wish I could tell people my story, but I never have. Some struggles are so solitary that they have drowned in words. I struggle to articulate how awful and isolating this feels, but I can't find the words. So over and over again, we have these mentions to depression being beyond description, beyond expression, people saying that they cannot find the words to express what they are feeling. And this really conveys also the estrangement that arises from the experience of depression. Perhaps we can start seeing that being unable to express, describe, or explain an experience which is so personal and which engulfs the whole being of a person can create problems and issues in their interpersonal relationships. If one feels that they do not have the words to express how they're feeling, then the elements of connection with other people can break apart. And this is what happens in depression. So it's not merely an individual problem, a problem of the individual not feeling able to effectively describe their experience, but problem with other people also communicating one's experience to other people and being understood by other people. So an interesting analogy that I find is with language. And let's look at Kristeva's quote here. She says, melancholia is an abyss of sorrow and non-communicable grief that at times and often on a long-term basis lays claims upon us to the extent of having us lose all interest in words, actions, and even life itself. And she further elaborates on the non-communicability of depression experiences by attributing depression to feelings of unhomelikeness in the world. And she says that the depressed individual is a stranger in her mother tongue. So at this point, I would like to go back to the first observation or statement that we looked at, where we introduced the elements of the home-like and the familiar. For everyone, I believe their mother tongue is something very familiar, home-like. So the thought that one could feel a stranger in something so familiar and home-like, I think is very striking that Kristeva expresses it in this way. So we have the contrast between the mother tongue, which is something fundamentally, I would dare say, home-like and familiar, and one being a stranger to something so home-like and familiar. And another phrase of Kristeva that I find striking is she describes depression as a non-communicable grief. She doesn't only recognize the state of depression as non-communicable, but she also describes it as grief. Of course, a question which could explore some other time is what exactly are people grieving? The short answer that I would give is they're grieving their previous life, their previous experience of the world, which again gives rise to this the uncanny feeling, the unhome-like, the current unhome-like experience of the world, and the past home-like experience of the world, which is perhaps something we can find in grief, in bereavement also. Looking at something, at a deceased person's clothes, perhaps, or photographs, or house, even something which is familiar to us in home-like, but in a different state without that person being there. I also found it interesting that Fiona Shaw, in her own depression memoir, Out of Me, she also makes reference to depression being that her experience of the world in depression, as she puts it, was in some language at once known, but long forgotten. So again, something that used to be familiar, something that used to be possessed by someone, but no longer is. And finally, on the concept of indescribability, it's interestingly not only the case that depressed people recognize that the experience of depression is indescribable, but also that indescribability itself exacerbates the aspects of depression that are themselves indescribable. So the recognition of indescribability itself exacerbates the experience. Let's look at this from a quote by David Foster Wallace. He begins his short story, The Depressed Person, in the following way. He says, the depressed person was in terrible and unceasing emotional pain, and the impossibility of sharing and articulating this pain was itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor in its essential horror. So, according to this account, it's not just the fact that depression is pain, depression is experienced as a horror, as a horrific experience, but the recognition that that pain, that horror, is itself non-communicable adds and exacerbates the experience. Perhaps if the pain and horror were in some way describable and communicable to other people, we wouldn't have this characteristic of depression. But the fact that there is pain and horror, which are on top of the pain and horror themselves, non-communicable, it seems that it exacerbates the experience of depression. And again, this is it reveals the interpersonal dimension of unhomelikeness, because in being unable to communicate one's pain and horror, one feels disconnected from other people, feeling that they cannot effectively communicate their whole world experience to other people. And now moving on into the incomprehensibility aspect. What's a further conclusion that we can, a further observation that we can make from the fact that depression is experienced as as fundamentally different to one's ordinary state of being in the world, is that one cannot understand what it is like to be depressed unless someone has experienced depression themselves. So, in the words of Wolpert, how she says, until one has experienced a debilitating severe depression, it is hard to understand the feelings of those who have it. And a very similar statement we have by many other people too. Depression, says Andrew Solomon, like love, traits in cliches, and it is difficult to speak of it without lapsing into the rhetoric of saccharine pop tunes. It is so vivid when it is experienced that the notion that others have known anything similar seems altogether implausible. Styron says, the pain of severe depression is quite unimaginable to those who have not suffered it. Depression remains nearly incomprehensible to those who have not experienced it in its extreme mode. And finally, a participant of Matthew Radcliffe's depression questionnaire, did back in the University of Durham in 2011, says, unless people have experienced it themselves, they find it almost impossible to understand that depression is totally different from what we all understand as being fed up, a bit down, or having a bad day. So all these accounts of depression, of course, they mention these, the horror of depression, the pain of depression, the suffering that exists in depression, but also they mention the incomprehensibility aspect, that the only way for one to understand and comprehend what it is like to be depressed is to have been through the experience, that it concerns such a fundamentally different way of existing, of being in the world, that I cannot simply describe it to another person. I cannot rely on empathy to communicate that, to effectively communicate my experience to another person. It has to be experienced. That's what people say. And just to connect that with some previous statements, the claim is that depression is such a fundamentally distinct way of being in the world that the only way to know what it's like to be depressed is to have been through the experience of such an unhome-like state of being in the world. So in this respect, certain experiential features of the experience, such as one's disconnection from the world, are really singled out by individuals as some of the aspects of the experience which are the most difficult to convey to others. And in emphasizing the significance of having one's experience of depression understood, we can additionally explore what it is exactly that obstructs other people from understanding the depressed person's experience. So we have another participant from the depression questionnaire. They say the disconnection I feel is the most difficult to convey. It's very difficult to explain to others who have never felt it that the world looks distorted and imposing and alien, and that I don't have a place in it. It's like being in a bubble with no sound or color, and a complete lack of familiarity in everything, even in places I know well, like my home. It's what I find interesting in this quotation here, this testimony, is not simply that this person says that it's very difficult to explain to others who have never felt it what the world looks like, but they identify specific characteristics of the experience that they find difficult to communicate to other people. First of all, that one is in a bubble, or they experience the world with no sound or color. It's particularly problematic to begin with. What does it mean to live in a bubble? What aspect of the experience is this person trying to communicate? It's interesting that they also make mention of the lack of familiarity, even in places one knows well, like one's home. And particular reference is made to their home. That again, going back to the beginning, that we see in depression, we see a contrast between the lack of familiarity and one's home. I think home is a big word. It has a lot of implications, has a deep meaning for someone. So to say that one lacks familiarity in their home is really striking of the experience of depression as giving rise to this fundamentally distinct way of experiencing the world. And other two participants of the same study, they say, when I try to describe it to others, it sounds like something you should just be able to snap out of or cheer yourself up, but that's just not possible, which I know from trying, they say. It's horribly suffocating and tiring. You feel you can't escape yourself. Let's look at one more and then see them together. They say, I think for me, the hardest part of depression is to communicate, is the hopelessness and the disconnection. People want you to snap out of it, pull your socks up, look for the positive. They don't get that hopelessness isn't anything to do with laziness or willpower, so much as something that engulfs you because of the depression. So it's really a feeling that engulfs the whole world experience of the depressed person. And all three accounts identify precisely which are the aspects of the experience of depression that are not comprehensible by other people. The thought that one can just snap out of it or cheer themselves up is really something that other people fail to understand. That's just because they have not been through the experience. So I think what's important or notable about these quotations is that they identify not only the incomprehensibility, but the precisely which aspects of depression are incomprehensible and why. Now going into the last final observation, and we'll finish by bringing everything together. As a result of the experience of depression being unhomelike, and as a result of people feeling that their experience cannot be effectively described to other people or be comprehended by them, they often use metaphorical language to describe their experience. And as we mentioned earlier, just given to remind ourselves of this otherworldly aspect of depression experiences, people describing it as a exile into foreign territory of the mind, or you're off on some other planet half the time, which really can also be identified as the aspects of depression that are challenging or impossible to be communicated. And also, they give us an idea of, or an insight into depression, that depression is this state of being in the world that is, as individuals say, is impossible or just challenging to be communicated to other people effectively. So the last resort, if you wish, is using metaphors to describe their experience. And they justify using metaphors in different ways. For example, Stern says that the use of metaphors of place and land suggests the departure from a place that is familiar to foreign land, where the rules, language, and customs are unknown to the traveler. So having this in mind, we can take into consideration what we have said so far, that depression is a fundamentally distinct way of being in the world, the incommunicability, the incomprehensibility, and move on to examine some metaphorical language and also see what this language, the effects of this language to the individual and interpersonal relationships. Dorothy Rowe, she says, in our attempts to convey to each other our personal experience of depression, we have called upon every kind of metaphor. Further on, she says, everyone who has experienced depression has a metaphor for that experience, sometimes expressed only in one's private language, sometimes in the language that one shares with another. Andrew Solomon says the following. It's a condition that is almost unimaginable to anyone who has not known it, what we have seen earlier. A sequence of metaphors is the only way to talk about the experience. So it seems from these quotations and many others that what's left is only metaphors to describe or explain the experience. And some of the metaphors are the following. People describe depression as a big black empty space, as a great big prison. Others describe it as being in a cage and feeling trapped and feeling that I'm being smothered, that I can breathe, that one is being suffocated. Or David Foster Wallace says that some people liken depression to being underwater, under a body of water that has no surface. At least so that no matter what direction you go, there will only be more water, no fresh air, and freedom of movement, just restriction and suffocation, and no light. A reason I think people use this metaphorical language to explain their experience of depression is that is in an attempt to relate or connect the experience of depression to something, to an experience that non-depressed individuals can relate with. Just because the experience of depression is so fundamentally distinct from ordinary experience, what people do is they use a metaphor which is structurally phenomenologically similar to an extent to certain characteristics of depression in an attempt to make depression communicable. So let's take the example of depression being underwater. All of us, or most of us, perhaps we have experienced being underwater. So this is something that we can relate our experience of being underwater to depression, or at least thinking that we are in the middle of the ocean and having no direction to go, that wherever we go, there will only be more water, as Wallace puts it here. We can at least imagine being in the middle of the ocean and being lost and seeing no land. Or we can at least imagine being in a cage and being trapped or suffocating, or being in a big black empty space, the big black space. These are easily, or to an extent, imaginable by non-depressed individuals. So by making the connection, depressed individuals hope through these metaphors to communicate an aspect of the experience that is structurally similar to an ordinary experience of the world. In other accounts, we see people saying that they live in a big, thick bubble, that they can see what's happening, but that they are cut off from everything. And also that another way they experience this that is in relation to other people. Rich says here, even if the queen came here, you wouldn't snap out of the bubble. So they describe the impossibility of going out of the bubble. And there is also the element of the world being dark, gray, or colorless. Doric and Martin, in an account they present, someone says, everything seems dark and gray, all color has drained out of the world. Another individual from the Durham Depression Questionnaire says that everything looks dark, black, and bleak. To me, it looks like the color and joy has been sucked out of the world, and that the world looks completely dull. So by looking at all these quotations, both the differences in how color is experienced, one feeling that they are in a bubble and that they are restricted in observing the world, but they cannot participate in the world, and also this element of feeling trapped, feeling as if one is suffocating, really has, in addition to depression not being effectively communicable to other people, has these negative ways in which one's relationships with other people are affected. And taking into consideration that, as Branton puts it in her book, life is about connection, there is nothing else, and depression is the opposite of that. It's an illness defined by alienation. It really gives us an insight into what we can expect to find in first-person testimonies. This contrast to depression, this contrast to life, this contrast to connection being depression, as being an illness defined by alienation. And another quotation by Tracy Thompson, in which she demonstrates these disturbance that happens in interpersonal relationships, is where she says, "It seemed to me that the basic definition of any mental illness, this persistent painful inability to simply be with someone else, might be lifelong, or it might descend like a sudden catastrophe, this blankness between ourselves and the rest of the world." The blankness might not even be obvious to others, but on our side of that severe connection, it was shell, a life lived behind glass. So Thompson here makes the contrast between the world experience of the depressed individual and the world experience of other people, as if there is something in between the experience of the depressed person and the experience um, of other people that makes connection with other people or participation in the world impossible. And finishing uh, this observation and this talk, the suggestion I would like to put forward is that the metaphors of depression can be understood or conceptualized through the metaphor of being a spectator in the world. So we see testimonies such as this over and over again in depression that demonstrate the disconnection between the person and the world, or the person and other people. I feel like I'm watching the world around me and have no way of participating. I feel disconnected from the world like a spectator. I feel like the world is happening around me and I'm standing still. All these demonstrate this spectatorial aspect of depression experiences, I think, which demonstrates that in experiencing the world as unhomelike, one, and on top of that, in feeling that that aspect of unhomelikeness is indescribable and incommunicable to others, there is also this loss of connection that happens in depression. That in belonging in another world or experiencing the world differently, one feels that they cannot access the world and participate in it. And finishing with this quotation by Ariana Matute, she says, "In depression, every week feels like the same cycle leading to nowhere. It's as if my whole life was a play, and each day is an ongoing scene at the stage, while I'm there sitting with the crowd just watching how my day goes by. Sometimes I feel like I'm no longer the director of my play, and not even a secondary character. I'm a spectator. I watch as everything is falling apart from my lack of response to certain situations." So by understanding the experience of depression through the metaphor of being a spectator, I think we can make sense of some of the interpersonal disruptions that take place in depression, but also the aspect of the unhomelikeness that arises in depression, and which helps explain or put in words or conceptualize the this fundamentally distinct way of being in the world. So the suggestion that I put forward aims to combine the feeling of the unhomelikeness, the feeling of indescribability and incommunicability, and going one step further, I attempt to explain or describe the implications of these indescribability and incommunicability, to which of course refer to the metaphorical language, which is sometimes mysterious and not immediately clear what people mean when they use such language, in an attempt to make depression comprehensible and understood by other people, but also by depressed individuals. Thank you very much, and I'm very open to any questions or thoughts you may have. Thank you for your attention.